Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Congress is getting ready to shift into full campaign mode after voting today on a continuing resolution that is expected to pass both the House and Senate that will keep the government funded through December 20th. They're all going to get out of town and focus on winning their re-election races. But before that happens, we do still have some time to spend with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, and one of them is joining us live from there now. I'm pleased to say Democratic Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois is with us here on Bloomberg. Sir, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you. Obviously, unless something goes unforeseen, terribly wrong today with the continuing resolution, it will pass. A shutdown will be avoided, as we've all expected here in Washington. It will be, and the can will get kicked down the road again. My question to you is, did it really need to be this way? Do we really have to do this whole song and dance over again in December?
Yeah, no, of course not. And that's what's so frustrating. So, yes, hopefully we will pass a bill. It's notable that it's not going to be passed under a rule, but under suspension, because Speaker Johnson doesn't have the support of his party to move this through. But it's expected to pass bipartisan, but it's not. We're not passing a budget. We're just kicking the can to December 20th, because for the last 6 months, we haven't been having the substantive conversations, discussions across the aisle with Democrats and Republicans about how do we want to fund our government, what should be our priorities, how to make the hard decisions that ultimately will have to be made before we pass the fiscal year 25 budget.
Well, and sir, when we consider those across the aisle conversations, when everybody comes back to Washington after the election, it'll be with the knowledge of whether you're staying in the minority or will have moved to the majority, whether or not the speaker will be looking at the prospects of still being speaker again, depending on what the new Congress looks like. Is he the most honest broker Democrats could hope to work with, or are you hoping there will be a change in Republican leadership?
Well, I'm not going to talk about Republican leadership. I hope there's going to be a change in House leadership, that the Democrats will retake the majority. I'll remind everybody that in the last Congress, Democrats had a 5-seat majority, the same margin that the Republicans started in this Congress. And in the last Congress, we were able to pass significant major legislation, most of it in a bipartisan way. This Congress, what we've seen is a Congress that hasn't been able to do anything, or almost anything, and it's been exceedingly frustrating. So I hope when we come back that the Democrats will have a majority, will be on a course to elect Hakeem Jeffries as the Speaker, and that in the next Congress, beginning in January, we'll get back to the table, roll up our sleeves, and get the work of the American people done.
Well, of course, some of that work you do from your role as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So with that seat in mind, sir, I'd like to ask you about what we're seeing in the Middle East. The Associated Press is now reporting today that the Israeli military is preparing for a possible ground operation in Lebanon. This is according to the Israeli army chief. It, of course, comes as we're seeing escalation in the exchange of fire on Israel's northern border. A missile was sent toward Mossad near Tel Aviv that Israel intercepted today. Where do you see all of this going, sir? Is Israel wise to be looking at a potential ground operation, or should they be doing everything they can to de-escalate?
Well, I think both can be true at the same time, and you have to start, where did this begin? On October 7th, as everyone knows, Hamas invaded Israel from Gaza, brutally murdered 1,200 people, took 250 people hostage, and started the war that has been raging for almost a year in Gaza. What's also notable is on the next day, the very next day, October 8th, Hezbollah started firing rockets into Israel in support of Hamas. And that has been going on now for, again, almost a year. More than 8,500 rockets, missiles, drones, anti-tank weapons have been fired by Hezbollah into Israel. Israel's been responding, and it has continued to escalate. 80,000 people have been evacuated from the border communities in Israel. Probably an equal number of Lebanese civilians have been evacuated, civilians who are not a part of Hezbollah but are suffering the consequences of Hezbollah's actions. So what Israel is doing is taking action against Hezbollah to try to secure its communities on the border with Lebanon. But this is also necessary to give security to the people in Lebanon who unfortunately are under the thumb of Hezbollah.
Well, and what role do you see the U.S. playing here if this continues to ramp up and we see more outward conflict between Israel and Hezbollah? Is there going to be an added need for the U.S. military presence in the region or just more arms support? What exactly should the expectation be on what this administration and this Congress, frankly, is willing to provide?
Yeah, I think the first thing you see is that the administration is continuing to try to create the off-ramps. Amos Hochstein is in the region. President Biden has been committed to trying to de-escalate and create the space to move Hezbollah back from the Israeli border and try to resolve the disputes peacefully. And I think the United States will continue to do that. At the same time, going back to October 8th when Hezbollah started striking, President Biden was very clear when he said don't, but he also backed up his words by sending aircraft carriers into the region. We continue to support Israel and Israel's right to defend itself, but we also should be supporting the Lebanese people. They've suffered. Lebanon, the economy is literally on its back, not even on its knees. The government is dysfunctional, all because Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is backed by Iran. Ultimately, it is Iran who's responsible, is holding back Lebanon from the possibility of moving forward. So I think the United States has a role to play there. And ultimately, as President Biden has said, Israel has a right to defend itself. The United States will stand with Israel as she does so.
I'd like to ask you about another conflict as well, the ongoing war in Ukraine, as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke at the United Nations General Assembly in New York today. Here is a taster of what he said, and I have a question for you after.
Ukrainians will never accept why anyone in the world believes that such a brutal colonial past, which suits no one today, can be imposed on Ukraine now instead of a normal, peaceful life. Do not divide the world. Be united nations. And that will bring us peace.
Congressman, of course, Zelensky will be traveling from New York down here to Washington. He will, in fact, be on Capitol Hill tomorrow, meeting with some of your colleagues before everyone leaves town. Should he, in his visit to Washington, feel confident that he's going to be able to count on the same support from a Congress or any future administration as Ukraine has had to this point?
I think I'll take us back to a question you asked earlier about who is in the majority next year in Congress. Democrats have stayed committed to Ukraine throughout this war, where it's been more than 30 months since Russia initiated its invasion in February of 2022. As Zelensky said in the piece I heard, and I have not heard his whole speech yet, but he talked about the will, the desire of the Ukrainian people to remain independent. Just after the start of the war, I heard the Ukrainian ambassador speak here in Washington, saying that the previous 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union was the longest period of independence for Ukraine in hundreds of years, and that the people who had come to appreciate their independence, appreciate their freedom, we're going to fight for that freedom with every ounce of energy that they have. And the Ukrainians have continued that fight. They have fought nobly and bravely against the Russians and the West under the leadership of President Biden, but working with our allies in Europe and other allies around the world have helped ensure that Ukraine can sustain its fight, and we need to make sure that it sustains its fight and that Russia cannot get either a strategic victory or ultimately take over Ukraine completely.
Will you, sir, be meeting with Zelensky tomorrow, or do you know of your colleagues who will be?
I will not be, but I don't know who's meeting. I'm not aware of any Foreign Affairs Committee meeting with President Zelensky. If something changes, I would love that opportunity.
Well, finally, before we let you go, sir, we have about a minute left. It's not just foreign affairs on which you sit, but you're also on the Ways and Means Committee. Knowing Kamala Harris is about to, just about 2 hours from now, give a speech on the manufacturing economy in which she may mention tax policy and raising the rates on, say, corporations or those with more than $1 million in income, their capital gains tax rate. To what extent can she reliably say those are policies that stand a chance of passing Congress, knowing we may well end up with divided government, even if she does win the election in November?
Well, irrespective of who wins in November, we know that the provisions of the 2017 tax code are going to expire at the end of next year. So Ways and Means in particular, but the House and the Senate as a whole will be digging deeply into the tax code and trying to develop new policy, hopefully new policy that will stand the test of time. And whatever tax policy we have has to be one that makes sure American companies, American workers can compete on a global stage, that we're investing in new innovations, new products, that we're training our workers, that we're developing the workforce for the future by investing in our kids. And so what I'm hopeful for next year as we open up the tax code and take what I believe and hope will be a deliberative and engaged and hopefully bipartisan approach to tax policy, we'll have policy that ensures that American companies lead the way.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. That's Democratic Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois, live on Capitol Hill right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The many stories our wonderful news team is producing, and one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal today has a headline that reads as follows. Ex-NFL linebacker duels Senator Cruz in surprise Texas nail-biter. As you might be able to guess, this is about the Texas Senate race in which the incumbent Republican Ted Cruz is facing a challenger from Democratic Congressman Colin Allred, who, yes, used to play football. Of course, Texas is a state Democrats have long dreamed of being able to claim could go blue. It is, for now, firmly red. Of course, we saw in 2018 Beto O'Rourke try to unseat Ted Cruz. He lost that race by a relatively narrow margin. It does seem, though, looking at polls, that Allred's chances might be a little bit better, depending on which poll, of course, you're looking at. We got one from Morning Consult just last week that found Allred was actually leading Cruz by a single percentage point, which does leave us in the margin of error. So as we consider this race and the other down ballot races to watch, let's assemble now our political panel. Jeanne Zaino, Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, today with Lester Munson, of course, principal of the international practice at BGR Group and Republican strategist. Lester, as the Republican, I'll come to you first. Obviously, Ted Cruz has faced challenges in the past, as I've mentioned, but does he have more reason to worry this cycle? Do you actually think he has a risk of being unseated?
Well, I think it's going to be a close race. I think it's less risky than it looks, but it will be close. Cruz lost to beat Beto O'Rourke 6 years ago by 2.5 points. That's not much. Texas went 2 years later. Texas went for Trump by 5.5 points. So Cruz trails Trump in polling. He's less popular than Trump is in Texas. I think he's still going to win. Colin Allred is a serious guy. He's a charismatic guy. He's a good candidate as far as I can tell. He's making this thing close. But I think at the end of the day, Texas is probably going to stay red on this race.
Well, so Jeanne, I do wonder what outcome it could actually define victory here for the Democrats. If not a victory for Colin Allred outright, would it be enough to just force money to be spent in Texas where it could have been spent other places in what was more understood to be the competitive races?
Absolutely. And the spending in this race is enormous. I have to take exception to my friend Lester. I have a few friendly bets on this Texas race. And I am going to
I know you Lester. Do, Jeanne.
Yeah, that's right, Kailey, right? And I am going to bet Lester. I think Allred can pull this off. Not only did O'Rourke come close, but Allred, to Lester's point, is an exceptional candidate. He's got an incredible life story. He is more moderate than Beto O'Rourke was. He has an enormous amount of funding and support on his side. And you can see Ted Cruz struggling to talk about his bipartisanship and the work he's done across the aisle, all of the things that we never expect to hear from Ted Cruz, who used to be the firebrand, candidate. So I think Allred does have a real shot here. But even if he doesn't come through and win, which he will, I think it is important because it really does show how this state has shifted. It is turning increasingly purplish. I know a young man who just moved to Dallas and to work. You see a lot of people going down there working. And Julie's great piece on Bloomberg today, she talks about the demographic changes. We don't know the impact because they don't have to register as a party or for a party when they go to register to vote. So we don't know what the impact of these demographic shifts are, but they may be potentially big.
Yeah, an excellent point and a well-deserved shout out to our colleague Julie Fine, our Texas bureau chief, who is the byline on this story on this race. Of course, she has long been warning us here at Bloomberg to keep an eye on this one because she does think it can be competitive. Of course, there's other races we're keeping more of an eye on now than we may have otherwise earlier in the cycle, including in Florida, Lester, where this is another instance in which you have a Republican incumbent who is facing a Democratic challenger. The incumbent in this case, of course, Senator Rick Scott. The polls are close in this race as well, perhaps not as close as in the Cruz Allred race. But what do you think is more likely, that Rick Scott could get unseated or that Ted Cruz could?
Oh, I think it's more likely Cruz is going to lose than Scott. Scott's a popular figure in Florida. He was a two-term governor. He's done pretty well in his career. He's not quite as iconoclastic as Ted Cruz is. And to Jeannie's earlier point, Ted Cruz is bipartisan. He often teams up with the Democrats to oppose what Mitch McConnell is doing. So he does have some things he could brag about in that respect. But I think Rick Scott and Ted Cruz both, at the end of the day, might be a little more marginal in Texas, are going to prevail.
Well, and of course, a lot of this may come down to money as well. As we were noting with Jeannie, there's a lot of money being spent in some of these races where Republicans especially are having to allocate resources when they might prefer to instead just focus on, say, Montana and Ohio, where the incumbent Democrats are exceptionally vulnerable. As we consider the money, Lester, obviously there's been reporting this week about the Trump campaign not giving to the same extent the Harris campaign has to the congressional and senatorial campaign committees on the Republican side. To what extent is that concerning, knowing that the Republican congressional and senatorial committees have been being outraised by their Democratic counterparts?
Well, Democrats are outraising Republicans across the board. Harris has a huge fundraising advantage over Trump. In Texas, as we were just discussing, Allred has more money in the bank than Cruz does. So, by the way, one of the things Democrats do when the Republicans outraise them is start talking about campaign finance reform as if it's a national emergency. It's weird that they're not doing that now, probably because they're doing so well in this regard. Maybe Republicans should be talking about campaign finance reform. I think at the end of the day, the money advantage for Democrats, in all seriousness, is a little bit baked in. Republicans have a better effort on the earned media side. In other words, they can go out and grab headlines by saying provocative things and kind of challenging the system. So it kind of balances, in my mind at least, these campaign advantages kind of balance out at the end, and neither one of them is really going to be determinative. All of these races are going to be close. House, Senate, President, they're really coin flips at this point.
Well, and your earned media point is certainly a good one. That, Jeannie, as we know, has been a specialty of Donald Trump. He may not have the actual war chest advantage against Kamala Harris, but he is an expert at getting that media attention. Do you think it's working as well this time, or has Kamala Harris been able to compete with him on that front, given just the very unique nature of her candidacy and how short it has been to this point?
Talking
Jeannie?
to young people. Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yep. Now we can. Here we go.
My fault. She has been able to compete. I was just talking to young people who spend a lot of time in the digital world, and they were talking about the fact that she's been able to compete, not necessarily because the campaign itself is doing that, but because people who are listening to the campaign and taking things like Donald Trump talking about Haitians eating cats and dogs and creating meme after meme after meme about that. And those have gotten millions and millions of views. So Donald Trump's rather undisciplined campaign, it does get him that earned media. He's the king of earned media, as Lester was talking about, but it also has resulted in Kamala Harris having sort of advocates on her side who take some of the off the wall things he is saying and make them into memes that really do go viral. So she's able to compete in that realm. She also is able to compete from the money. And just to go back to the Senate, I think if a year ago we were here talking about Democrats having a shot of holding the Senate, none of us would have believed it because the math is so much in the favor of Republicans. And that really does speak to how much this campaign really has depended on good candidates on both sides. And I would say Sheehan in Montana and Allred in Texas on both sides are example of keeping this really, really tight.
And of course, there's Larry Hogan to consider in Maryland as well, who was a very popular governor of the state, now running against Angela also Brooks, the Democrat. That's all on the Senate side, Lester. We have to consider the House here as well in our final couple of minutes, because, of course, Mike Johnson is going to, under suspension of the rules, be able to pass a continuing resolution out of his chamber today after failing on Plan A, which was a 6-month continuing resolution with the SAVE Act attached. Going out for the election season on that kind of performance, when you know coming back in November, you're going to know if you're still the majority or put down to the minority. What does his future look like realistically?
Well, first of all, to kind of echo what Jeanne said, a year ago, if we thought Mike Johnson would still be, I'm not even sure he was speaker a year ago. If we thought Mike Johnson would still be in this position as speaker through these last few months, I think we'd all be amazed. And so he's done quite well just to stay where he is. He's survived these votes before where he needs Democrats to come over and support him on the budget to get things done and avoid a government shutdown. I think he's going to survive this one. I think, and I realize I may sound a little glasses half full Republican here. I've seen him grow in office. He has demonstrated leadership. He got the Ukraine aid package across the finish line, maybe a little later than we all wanted, but he got it done. It was very significant. I've seen him, take these responsibilities on his shoulders and do it in a dignified and responsible way while trying to keep his caucus as organized as he can. So I think I would put my money, if I were a betting person, I would put my money on him being able to stay as the top dog with the Republicans, regardless of what happens on Election Day.
All right. Lester Munson is betting on Johnson. Jeanne Zaino is betting on Colin Allred in Texas. Our political panel today. Thank you both so much for joining me. And we'll have more straight ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Right here on Bloomberg, we are preparing about an hour and a half from now to bring you some remarks live from Vice President Kamala Harris as she speaks at the Economic Club of Pittsburgh. Yes, in the critical battleground state of Pennsylvania, with remarks that will be targeted specifically on the economy and the manufacturing economy at that. They, of course, will follow Donald Trump giving remarks of his own in Savannah, Georgia yesterday, talking about manufacturing, primarily focusing on tariffs and taxes as ways to incentivize making more in America. So the question today is what messaging, what policy could Harris put forward, and to what extent will it resonate with these key groups of voters that she is trying to target in states like Pennsylvania? So to help us answer these messaging questions, I'm pleased to say joining us now here on Balance of Power is Aisha Mills, a Democratic political strategist and social impact advisor. Welcome to Bloomberg, Aisha. Great to have you. So as Harris specifically, it seems, is looking at blue-collar workers here with this notion of trying to create a vision of the manufacturing economy, what is it that they need to hear? And therefore, what is it that she needs to say?
So, Kailey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I want to just kind of step back for a second, because I know that what happens in all of the political conversations is that we tend to like to marginalize ourselves into factions, right? So you've got the working class over here and the blue collar workers over here, as if they are divorced from the manufacturing companies themselves and the corporations who are manufacturing goods, but then also purchasing those goods and needing to, use those goods in their own business business lines. And so I think that what it is really important for us to do is to remember that the economy is powered by workers, and that we also need to understand that there is such a deep connective tissue there, that it's not just them versus us. And that is the thing that the other side tries to do a lot, is to pit business owners and corporations against the actual people who powered them. I think that Kamala Harris is going to go in and she's going to have a really great conversation just to that effect that I just mentioned. It is the people who power our economy, and we need to have manufacturing here in the United States to make sure that we're growing jobs. That's important. Obviously, imports are important too, but we can't just continue to say we're going to throw blanket taxes out there that end up being taxes on the American public and our pocketbooks, because it doesn't necessarily, affect the overall economic bottom line in a real improvement way. So I think that what she's going to do is she's going to actually speak to the people. She's going to speak to the workers and remind us all how valuable labor is to the fundamental fabric of our economy and our society. She's been doing that all along, and I think she's going to do that again today.
And is Pennsylvania the state that most needs to hear that message from her? Is it the most appropriate forum to be delivering it, knowing how critical, of course, that state and its electoral votes are to the outcome of this election?
Surely. And, remember, Pennsylvania is a home of American manufacturing, steel industry. President Biden talks about, his roots there in Scranton, where he's from, working class community. His father was a laborer. So absolutely, this is the perfect place for her to be bringing home this message, where there are generations of families who remember a time when you were a proud union member, a proud working person, a proud manufacturing, employee who cared about your job, was able to put food on the table for families, had a good income, was able to own a home. The price of inflation wasn't so crazy that you couldn't buy goods and put food on the table. And so there are people there who remember how fundamental the manufacturing industry has been to our American economy, and also are experiencing some of the pain of having lost a lot of that. So I think this is absolutely the right audience for her to have this conversation.
Well, and of course, Aisha, she approaches many of her conversations around the economy with her background as someone who was brought up in a middle-class family. She has emphasized that part of who she is quite a lot in much of her messaging. She's emphasized other parts of her identity, though, a bit less, including the historic nature of her candidacy as being a woman of color, the first ever, leading a major party's ticket in a presidential election. Of course, she was asked about that kind of demographic question, and black voters, black men in particular, in an interview with the National Association of Black Journalists earlier this month. I'll remind our audience here of her response.
I think it's very important to not operate from the assumption that black men are in anybody's pocket. Black men are like any other voting group. You got to earn their vote. So I'm working to earn the vote, not assuming I'm going to have it because I am black.
But when we consider the earning of the vote or the explanations as to why that vote should be cast for her, does her identity not play a role? If her identity as someone who had a middle-class upbringing is supposed to play a role in how voters view her, the way she approaches the economy, why can't it go for other things about her as well?
I don't think that that's what she said at all. Kamala is black. Kamala is also Indian. She's a biracial American, like so many people in this country. We are a multiracial society. And here's the other thing about our demographics is that we are also shifting in our demographics here in the United States, where we are seeing a new American majority of people of color and multi-race people who are absolutely on track to be the majority of the population of this nation. So what does that mean? Certainly from an electoral power standpoint, people of color will ultimately be the outnumber white voters in terms of their electoral power. That is the trend that we are seeing. That's what the demographics say. This directly relates to, who she needs to appeal to in order to get out the vote to win. And that's for, candidates of any party on all the sides. But also when you think about it as a more macro conversation beyond just this political cycle, our economy economy, our consumers, largest consumer group, one of the largest consumer groups in this country are African Americans. The number one business owners, folks who are starting businesses at a more rapid clip than anybody else in this country, are Black people, Black women in particular. 90% of the businesses in this country are small businesses, many of which are powered by people of color. Demographically, and from a market spend capacity, we certainly are powering the market as consumers, as people of color. So this is a macro trajectory that we are seeing in our demographics right now shifting. And here's where I think the fine point on this I'll make around this conversation is as it relates to politics and demography is that what corporations have always known, what businesses have always known, is that it's good business to do right by people, no matter who they are. And what you're seeing from Kamala Harris is embodying those values of inclusivity, of diversity being an asset, right, to the bottom line. What you're seeing on the other side with the Republicans is a real assault and an attack on diversity. An attack on diversity and an attack on inclusion and an attack on anybody who recognizes the power, and not just the power from a social context, but the power in our society of really embracing the majority of the people, certainly, and reflecting and representing their values. And so I think that, Kamala Harris's conversation across the board, be it on culture, be it on her own identity, be it on her economic policies, is absolutely reflective of where we're going and reflective of the demographic makeup of our society.
Well, I'd like to focus on another demographic as well, specifically women, in the way that both of these candidates are approaching the vote of women in this election cycle. We heard just this week from Donald Trump about this notion that he will be a protector of women. This is what he said, Aisha.
As president, I have to be your protector. I will make you safe at the border, on the sidewalks of your now violent cities, in the suburbs where you are under migrant criminal siege, and with our military protecting you from foreign enemies, of which we have many today because of the incompetent leadership that we have. You will no longer be abandoned, lonely, or scared. You will no longer be in danger. You're not going to be in danger any longer. You will no longer have anxiety from all of the problems our country has today. You will be protected, and I will be your protector.
So it strikes me, Aisha, that he's really focusing on kind of ideas of physical protection here, of physical threats that people could face. Kamala Harris has been talking a lot about the protection instead of rights and freedoms. That's a lot of where her messaging has centered on. What wins out?
Well, let me just first tell you how offended I am, and I speak on behalf of more than half of the population, women who make up more than half the population, how completely insulting and offensive it is for Donald Trump to throw around a very old age patriarchal trope to suggest that all us little women need is some big mouth guy to run around and protect us, when in fact it's him who's causing the things that make us most afraid and most fearful. I think that 57% of women fired Donald Trump and rejected him in the 2020 election. 57% of women. We certainly would never feel safe in a room alone with him, because he has said that he grabs them by the you-know-what, and he has been found liable for sexual assault. This is not someone who is anyone's protector, and certainly no woman's protector. And the fact that he would even, declare that really reflects to a very antiquated sense of patriarchy, and this kind of way that he is moving through his campaign, trying to galvanize a very bygone golden era of men thinking that they are dominant to submissive women, that they are just there to take control of and to protect, and whatever other language it is that's being used. I do believe that it's going to turn off. It has already turned off so many, if you just look at the conversations that are happening out in the public discourse. And when 57% of the women reject you, and that's how you show up, let alone assault on our health care, I don't think that it's a winning strategy for anyone other than men who have that same attitude.
Finally, Aisha, in our final minute with you, whether it's women, Black voters, any of the demographics we are talking about, just the American electorate as a whole, I think we know that a lot of this outcome could be dependent on just whether or not people turn out. What is the winning strategy for the Harris campaign to actually drive voters to go cast a vote?
Yeah. I mean, that's really important. You've seen so many different constituent groups based on ethnicity, be it Black or Latino or, demographics, if it's women, if it's LGBTQ folks, all come together saying we support Harris, including, by the way, white dudes for Harris, right? And why that matters is because the Harris campaign, aside from just having a multifaceted, diverse coalition that literally reflects the entirety of America, also has a very strong boots on the ground game. So across this country, she has thousands of field offices where there are volunteers and operatives who are going out, being deployed into the community all day, every day, meeting with voters, talking with voters, sharing information, hearing people's concerns, listening to their ideas, being able to take those back to the campaign and help shape the way that she's thinking about the way that she would lead and serve the American public. The thing that is really most promising right now from a campaign apparatus, if you compare where the Republicans and the Democrats are, is that the Democrats have a very wide, far-reaching boots on the ground strategy in almost every state. And that includes, of course, the big swing states that they have to win, but other states as well that we didn't even think were going to be in play, like North Carolina, for example. And so at the end of the day, all politics is local. And that's what she's doing, is she's getting out there and talking to people locally.
All right, Aisha, great to have you. Aisha Mills is a Democratic political strategist and social impact advisor joining us here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As members return to their districts or wherever they will be campaigning as we get closer and closer to the election, it is, of course, not just them, not just Washington, that is on edge with the uncertainty of it all. This applies to business as well. That's something, of course, we spend a lot of time talking about here on Bloomberg Radio, this notion that the policies these candidates are proposing could have an impact on the business and financial world to which we speak. And of course, the business and financial world in return is bracing for the potential outcomes here. And that's why I was especially struck by the survey that just posted from the Atlanta Fed. It's its latest CFO survey, in which it finds 30% of respondents at firms reported having either postponed, scaled down, delayed indefinitely, or even permanently canceled their investment plans because of election-related uncertainty. So we want to dig more into the survey data now and turn to Daniel Weitz of the Atlanta Fed. He's their survey director and is joining me now here on Bloomberg. Daniel, great to have you. This is obviously this 30% figure, higher than last quarter's figure of 28%. So perhaps uncertainty being felt more and more as we get closer to the election. But I also wonder how this compares to history. Are firms less likely to be making investment plans in this election cycle than in cycles past?
Well, thank you so much for having me. First, the usual Federal Reserve disclaimer that any views are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of the Atlanta Fed or the Federal Reserve System. With respect to your question, that's a great question. We've only asked this in this particular cycle, this quarter and last quarter. What we see in the literature, though, is it's not uncommon for investment to sort of dip ahead of some big risk events like presidential elections. But the question is it going to bounce back afterwards? Historically, we have seen bounce backs. I think, the question is, how big is the holdback this time relative to history, and will we see a bounce back afterwards, or will investment sort of stay low, and will those firms who are on the sidelines not jump back into the fray?
Well, yeah, and of course, I guess only time will tell on that one. I'm sure it also depends what that bounce back looks like, dependent on the kind of policies that are actually put into place with whatever administration we ultimately get. What is your sense of what the greatest concern of these firms are now around what that kind of policy could look like? What policy questions it is that are currently keeping them holding back?
Sure. So we asked firms about what topics were most important going into this year's elections. They listed a litany of topics. That the top four in terms of the most cited were regulatory policy, monetary policy, corporate tax policy, and fiscal policy. They all got, I think, between 50 and 60% of firms indicating that they were thinking about that. So, those are all very high on the minds of CFOs and business decision makers. So a lot to think about going into the election.
Well, don't we know it, Daniel? As we consider one of those areas, and I understand you are speaking to me from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, you mentioned their monetary policy. Did you ask any questions around Fed independence and whether companies are actually concerned about the notion that that could erode depending on what administration we end up with?
No, we didn't specifically ask about that. We do ask firms what their top concerns are every quarter, and monetary policy had figured, reasonably highly in recent quarters, but nothing regarding Fed independence that we asked about specifically.
All right, fair enough. I guess it would kind of be asking a question about yourselves in some way. It's like a journalist asking questions about media and journalists. It feels weird sometimes, but as we consider what this actually means for companies, you mentioned that there's a question around the bounce back, right? Whether or not all of a sudden this investment comes through as soon as the results are known and there's less uncertainty. But I wonder what happens to them in the meantime. You note here that firms whose investment plans are negatively impacted by election-related uncertainty also expected lower revenue and employment growth this year than their peers. So this does have an immediate financial impact.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We also note that their optimism, both about their own firms, but the economy in general, is about 10 percentage points lower for impacted firms than those that are not impacted. By that, I mean those that pulled back investment versus those that don't. So both optimism, lower revenue, expected revenue growth this year, and lower expected employment growth this year. What was particularly striking is those firms also, in the median and on average, expect the same employment and revenue growth next year. So that's to say, if you expected a bounce back, you might expect them to actually overshoot their peers so that they can catch up. We didn't see that firms were expecting that. They expected to lose some growth this year and then catch up with their firms next year, but potentially not regain that lost growth.
Fascinating. And when we consider the kinds of firms we're talking about here, is this more true for certain sectors or areas of the economy than others? Does it depend on what kind of space they're in?
From what we've seen, it seems to be fairly broad, but there's not one sector in particular that's particularly vulnerable. It seems to be fairly widespread across firms.
I'm just looking here at some of those issues that you were talking about, inclusive of non-labor costs is something that does appear here on the list of pressing concerns. But I also am wondering, as you have labor quality and availability ranked even higher than that, there is obviously a live conversation in this election cycle happening about immigration and migration, a potential crackdown that could be happening, frankly, no matter the outcome, as everybody seems to need to be more hawkish on that issue. How would that translate into companies' ability to fill positions they need to fill, to operate, to the economy overall, knowing we have seen a big labor market impact of immigration, depending on what these policies really look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. To the extent we asked about immigration policy as one of the policy topics that was important to the firms, it actually ranked, I think, in the lower half of the policy topics that were raised. But you're right, labor market concerns are still top of mind overall. I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty is one potential takeaway from this as to how the policies will evolve and how those potential policies will impact the labor market. There's just a lot of questions out there and not a ton of answers right now.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of us wish we had answers more immediately on a variety of different issues. Finally, Daniel, before we let you go, we heard Donald Trump yesterday outlining some ideas about manufacturing in particular, essentially giving lower taxes and lower regulatory burden to U.S. companies manufacturing products here in the U.S., tariffs being put into place for companies that don't. What kind of tariff concerns are companies, especially those that are importers and may need components that come from other places, even if they're assembling in the U.S., for example? How are you seeing that show up?
Sure. I mean, to the extent that those would show up in our question about concerns that firms have, it hasn't really risen to a top tier level, at least as it compares to monetary policy, labor market. those types of issues. And in terms of the policy topics that firms are thinking about going into the election, trade agreements are on the list. I think just over somewhere between 20 and 30% of firms have indicated that's something that they're thinking about. International tax policy is also something they're thinking about. But again, it doesn't rise to the top of the list, like at least for the policy topics, regulatory policy, monetary policy, or corporate tax policy. So it's definitely on their mind, but it doesn't seem to be top of mind.
All right, Daniel, it's a fascinating survey. Thank you so much for joining us to break some of the figures down. That's Daniel Weitz, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta survey director, with a look at how the CFOs are viewing this election uncertainty and their investment decisions around it. We'll have more straight ahead here on Balance of Power. I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Today we are watching escalating tension in the Middle East between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel today shooting down the first missile ever fired by the Iranian proxy group at Tel Aviv. Hezbollah saying that missile was aimed at the headquarters of Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad, just outside of the city. And in return, Israel is stepping up its heaviest air attacks on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon since 2006. We've already seen hundreds of people die as these strikes go back and forth, at least 50 of them children. Of course, this is all happening as the U.S. and other allies are urging de-escalation. In fact, Axios is reporting today that the U.S. is actively working on a proposal for a temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. But of course, the U.S. has also been pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas for months now. And we know that has yielded, so far, not the outcome they've been looking for. So let's get into more of this now with an expert on the region. Mara Rudman is joining me, where she is, of course, a professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, also director of the Ripples of Hope Project, focused on democratic solutions. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Mara. Always great to have you. As we consider this notion of a ceasefire on Israel's northern border between Israel and Hezbollah, do we have reason to believe this is easier to accomplish than a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas?
Thanks, Kailey, and good to be with you, even in these difficult times. To answer your question, no, nothing in this region is easy. Nothing in general in these types of conflicts and situations, not limited to this region, is easy. But there is reason to believe it may be possible, if difficult, to get to a temporary ceasefire, primarily because it's not in the interest of any of the parties involved to lead to something that would be an all-out war in the region and inevitably pull in Iran as well.
Well, I wonder how close we are to that line. We keep talking about this notion of potentially it becoming a war between Israel and Hezbollah, but when people are already dying by the hundreds, when we're already seeing these kinds of exchanges, the explosions of Hezbollah technology, pagers and walkie-talkies, of course, are we not already there? How should we be defining the activity that's happening?
It's clearly been an escalation. And horrific as it may be to contemplate, it unfortunately can get much, much worse. And one of the key lines would be if Israel launches a ground offensive as well, which there are reports of the Israeli IDF chief of staff has told reservists that have been called up for duty in the north that they need to plan for. So bad as things are, it can absolutely get worse. The one thing I do want to point out to you, Kailey, is how targeted these strikes have been to date in terms of southern Lebanon, even though, as always, unfortunately, there are innocent civilians in the region, in the area, who are directly affected. But the strikes have been targeted strikes, and starting from the most targeted possible, which was Hezbollah pagers and walkie-talkies.
No, that's a very important point, Mara. I appreciate you emphasizing that. We also have to consider that the body, the individuals or the technology being targeted here does belong to an Iranian proxy. So Iran theoretically is playing a role in this as well. To what extent should we believe Iran is directing or advising Hezbollah on its conduct, escalatory or not moving forward from here? And if it is Iran that potentially has the greatest incentive of all to encourage restraint?
So Iran absolutely has an incentive to encourage restraint. I'm not sure that Hezbollah itself is in a position either where their leadership would say this is the opportune time for an all-out assault. And frankly, Israel doesn't have an interest in going to the next level, which is a ground invasion, given that did not work out well for them in the past, even at the same time that it decimated southern Lebanon. But it ultimately, in the 1980s, for Israel, led to the growth of the Hezbollah that they confront today. So it's a complicated situation. No entity, as I said, has a real interest in escalation. But because of the relationships back and forth, and because of the interest in all of deterring the other's actions, we could end up there. And this is why the United States and other leaders in the region and throughout the world are working hard to de-escalate.
Well, and working hard still at a ceasefire between Israel and another proxy, Hamas. We have heard Israel say its end goal with this action in the north is to be able to return the Israelis from the north who have been displaced back to their homes. Hezbollah says if you want to do that, if you want the strikes on the north to stop, you need to end the war in Gaza. Is that really the linchpin to all of this? If a ceasefire agreement could be reached to end the fighting in Gaza, is that a credible solution to these other problems?
So I am a strong believer that these are all interlinked. Whether one solves or resolves another, harder to say. But to me, it's very clear that reaching a ceasefire in Gaza between Hamas and Israel, getting the hostages out, getting more humanitarian aid in, starting to plan for a day after, which frankly should have been going on already in terms of innocent civilians in Gaza, and frankly, Palestinians in the West Bank as well that are being increasingly affected by this, having a way forward. All of those things will help make more credible, give more tools to get to a ceasefire as well with Hezbollah. That's not to say that you shouldn't at the same time be trying for a temporary ceasefire with Hezbollah, given the increase in actions there. But in general, reducing tensions throughout the region is critical, and the steps forward that the United States laid out, frankly, back in June for a three-stage ceasefire with Hamas would absolutely be a huge help.
Well, and Mara, it's incredible to consider that this conflict, this war with Hamas, has now been ongoing for almost a full year. We are approaching less than 2 weeks from now 1 year since the October 7th attack on Israel. Are you concerned, given what we're seeing, of what that day, that marking could bring? Should we expect to see even greater activity around October 7th?
It's hard to know on what the anniversary date itself will bring, other than it is a point of recognition, or it should be, for all involved about how long this has gone on. Certainly about what triggered the actions in Gaza, the horrific attack on Israel on October 7th. It is a reminder of just how long the hostages have been enduring, hostages who are still alive, have been enduring what they are enduring under Hamas's control of them in the tunnels and other places in Gaza. So all of that is very difficult, for sure, and further should increase the interest of all involved in getting to these ceasefire agreements before we reach that anniversary.
Well, certainly. And of course, just less than a month after that anniversary will bring the U.S. election. And I wonder, Mara, the degree to which you think the uncertainty around that as to what kind of administration the United States will be offering in January, what that administration will look like, the kind of policy it's likely to pursue, is actually disincentivizing some progress in these areas, because everybody could wait and see if they end up with a friendlier outcome to their interests.
Yeah, I I understand why you're asking the question, and I understand why, from the United States perspective, that would seem to be something others are considering. I'm not sure for those in the region, as they're making day-to-day calculations, that weighs all that heavily. And so I think that we may overestimate how others throughout the world weigh their day-to-day actions. Not to say that who the United States elects in November would not have big consequences for the rest of the world, and most of the world recognizes that. I guess the point I'm making is just for the specific actions with respect to the conflicts we have ongoing there, I'm not sure it's that much of a factor. You can weigh it different ways for a number of the different players.
Well, that's fair enough and understood, Mara. Finally, before we let you go, if we consider what happens if this de-escalation or ceasefire agreement doesn't happen in the immediate term, to what extent would you expect that the U.S. has to get more actively involved? What that U.S. involvement could actually look like, knowing that if we look back to the attacks, Iran attempt to attack Israel that was largely intercepted with the assistance of the U.S. and other allies, would you expect that any U.S. involvement would stay that kind of defensive support realm, or could we actually be talking American troops on the ground, in the air, on the water?
So there's already been an increase in American troops to the region, I think probably primarily to help with evacuation and to shore up regional stability. I think that's happened just in the last week or so. And I think it's important to keep in mind that for the broader overall U.S. national security interest, Iran is a real concern, and Iran's behaviors are a real concern. And part of trying to resolve the immediate issues between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah, that the United States shares that interest with other key players in the region to be able to shore up an overall strategy and approach with respect to Iran for the region, which is part of the importance of getting as well to getting us back on a two-state pathway for a Palestinian and Israeli state. All of that is part and parcel of being able to deal with and address the Iranian concern, which remains at the forefront for the United States.
All right, we'll leave it there. Mara, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. Mara Rudman is a professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, also director of the Ripples of Hope project, focused on democratic solutions. We always appreciate her time.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.